don't think that any single phrase gets thrown around as frequently in the gaming community as FPS. If you have any actual statistics on this, we'd love to see them, but we couldn't find them. Still, even if it's not technically true, it seems to be the most frequently parroted phrase. And it's not like this is particularly annoying. That's not what we're saying, because we've talked a lot about it too. It's very integral to the overall gaming experience. Which is why we wanted to take a step back for a moment and explain the basics. What is FPS and what does it mean in games? We're sure that most of you know the answers to both of these questions, but hey, if you're young or just new to the gaming world, this video is for you. We've all had to start somewhere. And if not, you may still hear something useful that you didn't know before. For example, we make a couple of solid cases in favor of gaming on lower FPS. So without any further ado, let's begin. So what does FPS mean? This is both an incredibly easy and surprisingly hard question to answer. Easy in that it's an acronym that stands for frames per second, but difficult in that it's actually used to define two things. One, it shows how many images the graphics card will render in a single second, and two, how many frames your monitor displays each second. The first depends solely on the graphics card, while the second is also limited by the monitor's refresh rate, meaning how many times the display can refresh the image in any given second. A disconnect can exist between the two, but more on that later. When you hear a person say FPS, they could be referring to either of these meanings, or both. Which one is used depends largely on the context. For example, when people discuss graphics cards and compare benchmarks, they're referring to the first meaning. Additionally, there's a lot of debate over what the best FPS rating is overall, which leads us to talk about tiers of FPS. FPS ratings are usually divided into the following four tiers: 30, 60, 120, and 240 FPS. 30 FPS is the frame rate you're most likely to see in most console games, but low-end PCs rely on it as well. It's generally regarded as the bare minimum for a game to be playable, although most people only notice stuttering once the frame rate drops below 20. If you're skeptical about this statement, just remember that most movies are filmed at 24 FPS, and we're guessing that nobody here feels like they're watching a slideshow of images when they go to the movies. Next up is 60 FPS, which is generally regarded as the ideal frame rate, and for a good reason. Not only does it make the image smoother, but it actually has some performance benefits as well, but more on that later. The thing is though, only certain very well optimized console titles can run in 60 FPS, and while this frame rate is certainly more manageable on the PC, even then it can prove elusive, especially in newer AAA titles. After that, we have 120 FPS, which is certainly a noticeable improvement over 60 FPS in terms of smoothness and performance. But we do start to see some diminishing returns here, as the benefits aren't as impactful as they were when you made the jump from 30 to 60 FPS. This frame rate is only achievable on high-end PCs since it requires not only a monster of a graphics card that can render that many frames per second, but also a 144Hz monitor which can display all of these frames. And this tells you all you need to know about 240 FPS. It takes a ludicrous amount of money to get a graphics card and a monitor that can handle this absurd frame rate. But what's more, the human eye simply cannot keep up. Most people don't see any difference between 120 and 240 FPS, and even if you're one of those who do, it's usually just not worth it. Keep in mind that these four tiers are just sort of landmarks. FPS is inherently unstable, but the higher it is, the less the fluctuations become noticeable. So we know that there's a point after which further increasing the FPS becomes virtually pointless. But until that point, things are pretty straightforward. The bigger, the better, right? Yes, there are many benefits to having a higher frame rate, most notably a higher level of immersion, the lower input lag, and the fact that seeing more frames feeds more information to your brain, which in turn leads to better reacting times. But let's also take a moment to appreciate the upsides of low FPS. That's right, we kid you not, there are two reasons why you may want to tone down the FPS when gaming. Firstly, there's the issue of smoothness. Like we've already mentioned, frame rates are inherently unstable. How much so will depend on the game and on your PC, but in some cases it can be pretty bad. And in these cases, we find it preferable to cap the FPS at 30 and enjoy a smooth gaming experience than to suffer the erratic dipping and rising in FPS. And secondly, capping the FPS at 30 can also make the experience more cinematic by likening it to watching a film. Just watch a movie scene on YouTube that's available in 60 FPS but wasn't filmed for it, and you'll see how jarring it can be. This isn't recommended for all games, but it is an actual thing, capping the frame rate for immersion. Plus, if the game is older or it doesn't use motion capture technology, the animations actually look more clunky as the frame rate goes up. We've mentioned that there can be a disconnect between the FPS that your graphics card is putting out and the FPS that your monitor can display. This happens when the graphics card renders a frame rate higher than your display's refresh rate. And what happens when your monitor is trying to filter through 100 images in 1 second but can only physically handle 60 of them is what's known as screen tearing. This is also one of the reasons to cap your FPS so that it never exceeds your monitor's refresh rate. Now, if you want to know more about screen tearing and how to fix it, short of buying a monitor with a higher refresh rate, your best bet is VSync. We've made a whole video dedicated solely to this issue, so make sure that you check it out in case you're curious about this. There's a link to it in the description. And that about does it for this video. We know what we've said wasn't a revelation to many of you, but hey, you saw the title. And besides, it wasn't really long. But we also remember what it was like not to know what any of the technical terms that get thrown around mean, and how embarrassing it can be to ask. So if this is you, we've got your back. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, maybe share it with your friends, comment, all that good stuff. More informative videos like this one are on the way, so keep your eyes peeled. In the meantime, may your games be fun and your losses few. And as always, we'll see you next time on Gaming Scan.